Well, the Lions enter this offseason with a mix of optimism, coaching changes, uncertainty. There's a number of things going on in Detroit right now. But one of the biggest storylines around Allen Park is how Detroit is going to handle its free agency and contract situations. Because after missing the playoffs, fans are understandably curious about who's coming back, who might walk, and what this team's priorities really are right now from a player standpoint. And so I think one of the first things to understand is that not all the drama has been about players leaving. The Lions have already made pretty proactive moves, like agreeing to a 3-year contract extension with linebacker Derek Barnes. And so he's going to be kept under contract now through the 2027 season because he became a key contributor on defense. That was a big early splash because Barnes was someone who could have hit the open market, but instead Detroit locked him in a deal that reportedly includes significant guarantees. And I think that tells you that this front office values continuity on that side of the ball. I think some people have been asking questions about what about defense? Well, it looks like they're starting to address that. But Barnes is just one part of the bigger puzzle here because as the offseason keeps rolling on, Detroit's free agent class includes a mix of unrestricted free agents, restricted free agents, and players whose futures are still up in the air. And there are key names who could be re-signed, and there are others whose contracts might not get renewed at all. And I'm going to get into all that because that's where the questions start to pile up. The offensive side has its share of uncertainty, particularly around the tight end position. And if you haven't heard my segment on Sam Laporta and what we can expect from this new coaching staff, I encourage you to go listen to it. It's on the channel now. But Sam Laporta and Brock Wright are under contract through 2026. But for Laporta particularly, the conversation about whether Detroit should pursue an extension is heating up now. Now, some around the league think it's too early to bury that thought because Laporta is such an explosive weapon. And with his back surgery recovery still fresh, Detroit may want to wait and gather more information before committing long term. In other words, they want to see if after he heals, is he the same player? Now, meanwhile, there is a number of veteran tight ends who could hit the market. And there are whispers that bringing in a bigger name could fit what new offensive coordinator Drew Petzing wants to do schematically, particularly with 13 personnel packages, where a tight end who can stretch the seam could be a real difference maker for Goff in this coming year's offense. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. Is Sam Laporta going to get an extension this year? Or are they going to wait to see how he responds on the field? Are they going to let him play the season? Are they going to bring in another tight end? It's going to be interesting to see how they navigate that contract. Now, on defense, Alex Anzalone's contract situation has been one of the quieter but more intriguing storylines, if you will, because he's entering the final year of his deal and has publicly said that he would like to retire in Detroit. And I do think that there is a little bit of an emotional connection there because with fans, because the fact that negotiations have felt weird or stalled at times is something that can hang over a locker room if it's not resolved. And it's going to be something to watch as the offseason progresses with Anzalone because it's not been resolved, despite him saying that he wants to stick around. And you also have to factor in players like Kevin Zeitler, who was part of the offensive line last year. He ended up signing elsewhere, which shows how fluid the free agent market can be and how Detroit might lose established starters if other teams value them more, or if the money and opportunity make more sense elsewhere. And it's not just about players walking, because Detroit has been busy bringing reserve and developmental talent back on future contracts. Guys like Jacob Sailors, Nick Whiteside, Jabari Small, and several others are back on reserve and future deals. And that keeps depth in place while the Holmes administration, if you will, kind of figures out how to evaluate the bigger stuff. And I think that leads us to some of the questions that everybody's asking. And it's which of the Lions' own key contributors are most likely to be re-signed this offseason. And the answer isn't simple because Detroit has built a competitive roster and multiple players will draw interest elsewhere if they do hit the open market. Analysts and even fan sites that have done ranking and breakdowns of the Lions free agent group point out that Detroit has a handful of core players who would be priorities to bring back if cap space and value align. And so this is going to be an interesting situation because they also note that some guys will inevitably be more expensive to retain than others, forcing the front office to make tough choices about where to allocate money. Now, part of those tough choices is going to be shaped by how the Lions have structured their current big contracts. Guys like Hutchinson already signed a massive extension last year, so that locks him up. And that gives Detroit stability at one of the most important positions on the field. And so that kind of long-term deal gives the team a foundation to build around, obviously. But it also means the cap situation down the road is going to dictate how aggressive they can be in free agency. I mean, they're tight. They got a lot of players on huge deals right now. The narrative around Detroit's offseason priorities is basically this. Extend the players who are foundational pieces like Barnes and Hutchinson. Figure out how to keep other important contributors through smart pricing and negotiation. And then use free agency to plug holes in that experience where needed, rather than just filling every gap with big money. That's the position they're in. And there's also the NFL draft to consider, which is not that far away. And that's going to be a key factor in how they reshape themselves heading into next season and beyond, because we already have some ideas and suspicions about who they're going to be drafting and what positions they're going to try to target. I think it's also worth remembering that free agency isn't just about who comes and goes. It's going to also be about how those moves fit into the team's overall strategy. And for the Lions, that means balancing internal extensions with external signings and understanding that every contract carries a ripple effect on the rest of that roster. Now, they have shown a willingness to lock up important players like Barnes. I'm glad that got done. And they've shown a patience in some contract conversations like Anzalone, but they've also shown that they're not going to be shy about letting veterans walk if it makes sense for the roster and the cap. And so as we get deeper into the offseason, I think we need to pay attention to how the Lions approach which contracts they prioritize, which players they chase on the open market. We're going to be covering all of that. And which young talents they decide to build around long term. Because everybody knows that free agency is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And how the Lions are going to handle this phase is going to tell us a lot about how serious they are about turning last season's playoff miss into a springboard for future success. I mean, none of us want to go down that road again. And so if you're listening closely to the reporting on this and the ongoing contract tracker updates like we are, like I am, the story of this Lions offseason isn't just who leaves or stays, it's how Detroit balances ambition with pragmatism and how they position themselves to make noise in a division and conference that's only gotten tougher year after year. We're going to keep an eye on it. Keep it locked. You're listening to Midnight Sports Detroit.